Well, hello there. Let's talk about the Middle East, a region that seems to be in a perpetual state of just when you thought it couldn't get any worse. And last night, it did. The United States and Israel launched a massive, coordinated military assault on Iran, a move that has sent shockwaves across the globe and pushed us all to the brink of a much larger, much scarier conflict. President Trump, in his signature understated style, announced that U.S. forces had obliterated key Iranian nuclear sites in something called Operation Midnight Hammer. This sounds less like a military operation, and more like a terrible heavy metal band that opens for Nickelback. Meanwhile, Israel was busy hitting its own long list of targets across Iran, from command centers to gas fields, turning a tense situation into an outright firestorm. This wasn't some minor skirmish. We're talking about a significant military event involving over 125 U.S. aircraft, including Media Group, U.S. Air Force stealth bombers in flight, footage of massive bomb being loaded onto military aircraft at its stock at distribute_equally, stealth bombers dropping gigantic 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs. For context, that's a bomb so big, it probably has its own agent, and a rider demanding only Green M and Miss Iran, predictably, did not just sit back and take it. They responded by firing over 40 long-range missiles at Israel, causing injuries and widespread panic. Now their parliament is threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, a tiny strip of water that is basically the world's oil jugular. This whole mess isn't just a military escalation. It's a full-blown crisis that touches on Media Group, UN Security Council emergency session, close-up of nuclear treaty documents and gavel at its stock at distribute_equally, international law, nuclear treaties, and the very real question of who gets to decide when it's okay to start a war. The fallout has been immediate and chaotic. We're seeing tragic reports of civilian casualties, with Media Group, emergency responders carrying wounded civilians in Iran, destroyed residential buildings with civilians searching for survivors at its stock at distribute_equally, hundreds killed and thousands wounded in Iran, and dozens killed or injured in Israel. The global economy is already getting the jitters, with oil prices spiking and stock markets tumbling. And just to add another layer of fun to this global anxiety sandwich, the US has issued worldwide travel warnings, basically telling its citizens, hey, maybe stay home for a bit, because a lot of people are very, very angry with us right now. This is the kind of situation that makes you want to crawl under a very heavy, preferably bomb-proof blanket, and not come out for a while. So how did we get here? And more importantly, was any of this legal? That's the multi-trillion-dollar question. The actions taken by the United States and Israel raise profound questions about the rules that are supposed to govern how countries behave. We have a set of international laws and treaties designed specifically to prevent this exact kind of unilateral, world-destabilizing violence. But it seems some countries treat international law less like a binding contract and more like a terms of service agreement, something you just scroll past and click, I agree, without actually reading. Over the next few minutes, we're going to untangle this mess and look at who's breaking what rules and why it matters to every single one of us. To understand just how badly things have gone off the rails, we need to talk about the rules. Yes, there are rules for war, which sounds a bit like having rules for a food fight, but they are incredibly important. The big one is the United Nations Charter, the foundational document of modern international law. Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter is pretty clear. All member states, which includes the US, Israel, and Iran, must refrain from the threat or use of force against another state. It's the international equivalent of use your words, not your fists. There are only two exceptions to this rule. The first is self-defense, but it has to be in response to an actual armed attack, not a potential future one. The second is when the UN Security Council authorizes military action to maintain international peace. Now let's look at the recent strikes. Did the UN Security Council vote to approve Operation Midnight Hammer? No, of course not. In fact, countries like Russia and China are already condemning the strikes as a blatant violation of the Charter. So, what about self-defense? Well, the US and Israel are arguing that their actions were a form of preemptive self-defense meant to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. The problem is, international law is very squeamish about preemptive strikes. Allowing countries to attack other countries just because they might become a threat in the future would create global chaos. It's the plot of Minority Report, but with nuclear bombs instead of Tom Cruise, which is somehow even more terrifying. Then we have the laws around nuclear weapons, which are governed by a landmark agreement called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. The NPT is essentially a grand bargain. Countries without nuclear weapons promise not to get them, and in return, the 5 original nuclear weapon states, the US, Russia, China, the UK, and France, promise to work towards disarmament. The treaty also gives countries the right to pursue peaceful nuclear energy, as long as they agree to inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency to make sure they aren't secretly building bombs. It's a system built on trust, verification, and a shared understanding that a world full of nuclear weapons is a profoundly stupid and dangerous place to live. This entire framework is designed to prevent exactly what just happened. The system is supposed to use diplomacy, inspections, and sanctions to handle disputes, with military force being the absolute last resort, sanctioned only by the international community as a whole. Unilateral military action, especially on this scale, fundamentally undermines the entire post-World War II legal order. It sends a message that powerful countries can simply ignore the rules whenever they feel like it. It replaces the rule of law with the rule of the jungle, where the biggest animals get to do whatever they want, and everyone else just has to hope they don't get eaten. And right now, the jungle is looking pretty damn scary. Now let's talk about Israel, because its position on nuclear weapons is, to put it mildly, complicated. It's complicated relationship status on the world stage. Israel is one of only 4 countries that has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, along with India, Pakistan, and South Sudan. For decades, Israel has maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity, or as it's sometimes called, nuclear opacity. This is a fancy way of saying, we won't say if we have nuclear weapons, but we totally have nuclear weapons, so don't even think about messing with us. It's widely understood that Israel possesses a significant nuclear arsenal, making it the only nuclear-armed state in the Middle East. This refusal to join the NPT creates a massive problem for the global non-proliferation system. The entire treaty is based on the idea of fairness and universal application. When a country in a highly volatile region has a secret nuclear arsenal and refuses any international oversight, it creates a massive double standard. Iran and other Arab nations have long pointed to Israel's undeclared weapons as a source of regional instability and a justification for their own military and nuclear ambitions. They essentially argue, why should we be held to a strict set of rules when our neighbor is sitting on a pile of nukes and won't even admit it? It's a legitimate question, and one that makes enforcing the NPT in the region incredibly difficult. Because Israel is not an NPT signatory, it is under no legal obligation to allow inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency to visit its nuclear facilities, like the one at Dimona. The IAEA is the world's nuclear watchdog, and its job is to verify that countries are using their nuclear technology for peaceful purposes only, but they can't inspect what they aren't allowed to see. This lack of transparency means the international community has to rely on intelligence estimates to guess the size and scope of Israel's arsenal. This creates a deeply hypocritical situation where countries like the United States condemn Iran for its nuclear program, while simultaneously turning a blind eye to Israel's far more advanced and weaponized one. This double standard is at the very heart of the current conflict. Israel has repeatedly stated that it will never allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon, a policy it has now enforced with military strikes. Yet it does so from the position of an undeclared nuclear power that rejects the very international treaty designed to prevent nuclear proliferation. This fundamentally weakens the moral and legal high ground it claims to occupy. You can't lecture someone about the dangers of smoking while holding a lit cigarette in one hand and a carton in the other. It undermines the credibility of the entire non-proliferation regime and fuels the cycle of mistrust and escalation that just exploded across the region. So, with all this talk about Iran's nuclear program, you might assume they've always been the bad guys, secretly plotting to break all the rules. But the history is actually much more nuanced than that. For years, Iran has been a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. This means that, unlike Israel, Iran legally committed to not developing nuclear weapons and agreed to have its nuclear facilities inspected by the IAEA. Yes, there were periods of suspicion and dispute over its activities, which led to heavy international sanctions. But this is precisely what led to the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. The JCPOA was not just a deal between the United States and Iran. It was a major international agreement negotiated by Iran and the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, plus Germany. Under the deal, Iran agreed to the most intrusive and stringent nuclear inspection regime ever negotiated. They dismantled thousands of centrifuges, shipped out almost all of their enriched uranium, and even poured concrete into the core of a heavy water reactor to render it unusable for making weapons-grade plutonium. In exchange for these concrete, verifiable steps, the world agreed to lift the crippling economic sanctions, and for years, it worked. The IAEA repeatedly confirmed that Iran was holding up its end of the bargain. Then, in 2018, everything changed. President Trump unilaterally pulled the United States out of the JCPOA, calling it the worst deal ever. He did this despite the consensus from his own intelligence agencies, international inspectors, and all the other signatory nations that Iran was fully compliant. The United States then reimposed its sanctions and launched a maximum pressure campaign designed to cripple Iran's economy. This decision effectively blew up the diplomatic pathway that the world had spent years building. The other parties to the deal, like Europe, Russia, and China, tried to salvage it, but without the United States, the deal was on life support. Iran, for its part, waited for a full year, hoping the other countries could offset the United States sanctions. When that didn't happen, Iran began to gradually and openly reduce its compliance with the JCPOA's limits. It started enriching uranium to higher levels and building up its stockpiles again, steps it was careful to announce publicly. It's important to understand this context. Iran did not begin to ramp up its nuclear program in a vacuum. It did so only after the United States had abandoned the deal and reimposed sanctions. Iran's leaders argued that if the United States was not going to honor its commitments, then Iran was no longer bound by its own. This is the crucial backdrop to the recent strikes. The crisis we are facing now was not inevitable. It was the direct result of a diplomatic agreement being deliberately dismantled. Let's turn our attention back to the United States and Operation Midnight Hammer. Beyond the obvious violation of the UN Charter by attacking a sovereign nation without approval, there's another major legal problem here, and this one is domestic. The President of the United States does not have the power to be a king. The United States Constitution is very specific about this. Article 1, Section 8 explicitly gives Congress, and only Congress, the power to declare war. The founders did this on purpose. They were deeply suspicious of giving one person the authority to unilaterally send the nation into a major conflict. They wanted the decision to go to war to be debated and approved by the people's elected representatives. Of course, presidents have been testing the limits of this power for decades. This led to the passage of the War Powers Act in 1973, which was supposed to be a check on presidential power. It requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action and forbids those forces from remaining for more than 60 days without congressional authorization. However, President Trump's decision to launch a massive, pre-planned military assault on another country without any consultation with Congress is a flagrant disregard for both the spirit and the letter of these laws. This wasn't a small retaliatory strike. It was a full-scale act of war, initiated by one man. Legal experts and lawmakers from both parties have been quick to condemn the move. They argue that claiming preemptive self-defense against a non-imminent threat does not give the president a blank check to bypass Congress. If the threat from Iran was so grave and so urgent, the administration should have presented its evidence to Congress and sought authorization, as the Constitution requires. By skipping this step, President Trump not only violated United States law, but also set a dangerous precedent. It suggests that any future president can launch a major war based on their own judgment, without any democratic debate or oversight. This is a direct assault on the system of checks and balances that is supposed to be the bedrock of American democracy. This move is part of a broader pattern of undermining established norms and laws. First, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, a UN-endorsed international agreement. Now, it has unilaterally launched a military attack in violation of the UN Charter and its own domestic laws. This creates a perception of the United States as a rogue actor on the world stage, one that believes it is above the very laws it helped to create. This not only damages America's reputation and relationships with its allies, who have been urging restraint, but it also erodes the entire international legal system. When the world's most powerful nation decides the rules don't apply to it, it encourages others to do the same, making the world a much more dangerous and unstable place for everyone. When politicians and generals talk about military strikes, they use sanitized language like surgical precision, collateral damage, and degrading enemy capabilities. But behind this jargon is a brutal and devastating human reality. The recent attacks on Iran and the retaliatory strikes on Israel have inflicted a horrific toll. Reports are still coming in, but we know that over 950 people have been killed in Iran, including at least 430 civilians. These are not just numbers on a screen. They are people who are going to work, sleeping in their beds, or playing with their children. In Israel, Iranian missiles have killed at least 24 people and wounded over 1,000 more, shattering the lives of ordinary families. The impact extends far beyond the immediate casualties. The strikes have created a humanitarian crisis. Thousands are wounded, overwhelming already strained hospitals. Infrastructure has been destroyed, not just military targets, but also civilian areas. In Iran, the targeting of gas fields could lead to energy shortages for countless people. In Israel, sirens and explosions have become the new normal, creating a pervasive sense of fear and trauma. And across the world, protests have erupted. We're seeing large anti-war demonstrations in Tehran, but also in New York, Munich, and other major cities, as people voice their anger and fear over a conflict they never asked for. This is the real cost of war. It's paid in blood, tears, and trauma by ordinary people. Then there is the economic fallout, which will affect all of us. The moment the attacks were confirmed, global oil prices surged. The threat of Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point for nearly 20% of the world's oil supply, has sent markets into a panic. Experts are warning that oil could soon top $100 a barrel, which means higher gas prices for everyone, increased costs for shipping goods, and a potential slowdown of the global economy. Stock futures have fallen, and even cryptocurrency markets have taken a hit. This is a stark reminder that in our interconnected world, a military conflict in one region can have a direct and painful impact on the wallets of people thousands of miles away. Ultimately, the greatest cost might be the complete annihilation of trust. Diplomacy requires a basic level of confidence that the other side will honor its commitments. The United States unilaterally shredded the JCPOA and has now followed that up with bombs. Iran, which had been engaged in new rounds of nuclear talks as recently as last month, has now declared that the diplomatic path has been blown up. This breakdown of trust is incredibly dangerous. It removes the off-ramps and the safety valves, leaving military confrontation as the only perceived option. It pushes all sides further into their corners, making compromise impossible and further escalation almost inevitable. The human cost isn't just measured in bodies, but in the death of hope for a peaceful solution. So where does this leave us? In a very, very dangerous place. The immediate international reaction has been one of widespread alarm. While a few voices have supported the strikes, the overwhelming global consensus is a call for immediate de-escalation. Key United States allies like the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, along with regional powers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are urging restraint. They understand that a full-blown war between the United States, Israel, and Iran would be a catastrophe with no winners. It would destabilize the entire Middle East, trigger a global economic crisis, and create a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions. Even those who are wary of Iran recognize that this is not the way to handle the situation. The institutions designed to prevent this kind of crisis are scrambling to respond. The IAEA has called an emergency meeting, and Iran has requested an emergency session of the UN Security Council to address what it calls an unlawful act of aggression. But these bodies are now in an incredibly difficult position. Their authority has been openly defied by one of the Security Council's most powerful permanent members. How can the UN effectively mediate a conflict when one of the primary belligerents has shown a willingness to completely ignore its charter? It's like asking a referee to officiate a game after the star player has punched them in the face, taken the ball, and set the rulebook on fire. This crisis is a brutal lesson in the consequences of abandoning international law and diplomacy. For years, there was a framework, the JCPOA, that successfully contained Iran's nuclear program and provided a channel for communication. It wasn't perfect, but it was a functioning alternative to war. The decision to dismantle that framework and replace it with a policy of maximum pressure has led directly to this moment of maximum danger. It proves that when you close the door on diplomacy, you open a window for war. And once that window is open, it's incredibly difficult to close it again. The world is now watching, holding its breath, hoping that sanity will somehow prevail. The path forward, though difficult, must be a return to the principles that were so carelessly discarded. It requires an immediate cessation of hostilities and a recommitment to the rule of law. It means acknowledging that security cannot be achieved through unilateral military action, but only through mutual respect, negotiation, and verifiable agreements. The international community must pressure all sides to step back from the brink. The alternative is a regional war that could easily spiral into a global conflict, with consequences too horrific to contemplate. Following the law isn't a sign of weakness. It's the only real foundation for lasting peace and security for everyone. Let's hope the world's leaders remember that before it's too late.